Hi, everybody, back again. Here talking about World War II. This time over here, we're talking about the battlefront more than anything today, how that really influences the United States during World War II. Now, this should build off of things maybe you looked at the American home front during World War II already, and that should really give you a grasp of idea that there are so many different things that were influenced or that are very influential in the American home front during this time period. Now, most influential doesn't mean the most positive. It could mean the most negative thing, but it's influential nonetheless. Kind of the discussion you may have around Andrew Jackson or Christopher Columbus. But we're really going to dive into that subject a little bit more today as we go into the battlefront of World War II. We're going to keep going into this discussion of really looking at our objectives because it's really important. It's easy to skip over these things, but really understand what the bigger picture we're hoping for. Understanding where and how America really grows into world power. These are kind of that transition to that moment. And then the differences about attitudes about the nation's proper role in the world. There are definitely debates about the positive or negative connotations of it. Should we not? And it's different at different points in the war. And then really how these different forms of communication tech change the United States. And that could be military tech, that could be tech more used for civilian use. But regardless, a lot of things that are very influential. Also looking at how World War II transformed American society. That was part of our last PowerPoint segment. And then really this is going to be our biggest focus, the causes, right, of the US and its allies over the Axis powers. And then there's going to be a lot of effects that we're going to be lingering into for the future. Consequences of World War II as a whole on the United States. Consequences is a neutral term, could be positive, could be negative, but there will be changes nonetheless. And then really just that contextualization moving forward. How significant is this in shaping an American identity or various events, whether it be the Great Depression, World War II, World War I, the Progressive Movement, whatever it may be, Spanish-American War, all these different examples that we can really start to look at. Let's dive in. All right, so a couple maps just to get us started. So when we're looking at World War II, World War II is really unique where there's two different theaters of war, as they sometimes call it, two different locations that are drastically different in this. The first one we'll take a quick look at is Europe. When we're looking at Europe, all that area of red is bad. Red is all the areas controlled by the Axis powers. This is a relative map around 1941 when America decides to join World War II. We do not join it when the odds are in the Allies' favor. We join a side that looks like they're losing heavily. Now, remember, we don't go into fighting in Europe because we directly want to. The only country we initially declare war on is Japan because Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Then Germany and Italy declare war on us a few days later, and then we decide to go to Europe. So Americans are sent to two different eras or areas on the globe. Germany controls most of all of Europe. The only area that they really don't control is Great Britain. Spain and Portugal are not resisting them at all. I usually look at them as more of allies in all but name. And then Switzerland is neutral. They have geographic protection. There's all these mountains that surround it, so they're kind of hard to invade, and they're not really a force to really care about for the Germans. There's not a big issue. The only one they have is the British, and as they try to bomb and take over Britain, they fail a couple times. They move and turn their attention on the Soviet Union, stab them in the back, and then they still are able to control and push deeper and deeper into Russia. We also have control in northern Africa. They're threatening control the Suez Canal, which is a major waterway going in through Egypt that would then lead them into what we would call today the Middle East. So it's not looking good. Now, what's going on in the other half of the world? Japan is no longer just that tiny island nation. They're expanding into mainland China. They're taking over a lot of this area in the Indian Ocean. They control a very, very different empire. It's not a massive landmass. It's going to make this very, very difficult for us moving forward, but it's going to create very different, unique strategies. Regardless, over the next couple years, we are going to begin to win the wars in Europe and the Pacific, but they're going to take very different paths. We're going to start with Europe first, and then we'll come back to Asia. All right, so let's start here in Europe. Europe 1941. The reason I use the year 1941 is that's the year that America actually decides to join the Second World War. Up till about 1943 is when some big plans start to really, really change. During this time period, there are two really different campaigns or decisions that are proposed. Number one, the U.S. originally wanted to attack directly into Nazi-controlled France in 1943. They wanted to go for a big knockout blow right at the beginning. Don't let them build up. But it's going to cost a lot of human lives, and it's not something that all the other countries are necessarily willing to risk. Ooh. Meanwhile, we have another plan that's going to be a lot safer. It's easier to inch through. It's easier to control territory, and they're going to move all the way up through Africa into the southern part of Italy, and then move through Italy as we take away their allies and push ourselves deeper into Berlin. Now we're going to start with the second plan, but because we do this, it's going to take the war a lot longer to come to an end, and the Soviets are the one taking the largest brunt of the German forces, so they're going to be very, very upset. Stalin is not going to be happy with this plan. It's going to take some time before the Americans and the British really begin to change their plan for a different assault. Germany really is pushing deep, deep into the Soviet Union, but around the beginning of 1943, things start to change, and the Soviets are able to fight back a little bit and put them on the ropes. A lot of Hitler's men and supplies are really being depleted. They're attacking in the middle of winter, kind of like Napoleon does in centuries prior. But if for neither one of those men, it's going to take any positive outcome in that regard. It's going to just facing not only men but nature. It's really, really tough, bitter winter there. They're going to be trapped. A lot of people are going to starve, lose food. Army is going to be depleted. And as the Soviet Union pushes deeper and deeper into Eastern Europe, they're going to, and I have this in quotes, freed Poland, Hungary, and Romania. They're going to take control as kind of like, oh, we're in the military kind of aspect of things right now, martial law. We're making sure that the Germans don't really take control. And the big question is, are they going to ever relinquish control of these again in the future? And that's going to be a huge discussion we're going to have to deal with later in the war. In World War II, we do see a lot of changes where America's Navy is really being put to the test, and a lot of our manufacturing bases on the East Coast is really being put to the test. We are really going to start to turn the tide with our industry for sure. We're going to have a lot of mainland travel or kind of direct path travel to the UK, and we're really going to use that heavily. But we helped kind of monitor this in about 1941. Once we have the Lend-Lease Act, we start creating some trade networks to really bolster the Allied forces. But in 1943, when America actually is fully into the war for about a year now, we take full control of this, really bolster that trade network, getting supplies, getting ships, getting munitions, men over to Europe quick. And we really, really, really set up not only just trade networks, but kind of just moving people through. And then by the time we get to 1943, the war is starting to change, but it really hasn't taken a massive tilt in the Allies' favor. In 1941, or 1943, we're gonna see a lot of these conferences start being held, and we're gonna talk about three major ones in this lesson today. But in 1943, the major leaders of the big three countries, the Allied forces, FDR, the United States, Winston Churchill of Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union are all going to meet in Iran, Tehran. This is going to be the very first of three major wartime conferences. And the reason these are important is these are these big groups and gatherings of these major leaders to make these huge decisions. They're going to start to coordinate their brand new war strategy and how they're going to ultimately bring an end to this European threat of Hitler and Germany. And at Tehran, the way I remember what's said at Tehran, they decide on the turning point. These go together. Tehran is the turning point where they decide on a monumental attack wave. They're going to commit to a full frontal assault on Nazi-controlled France to try to really open up a second front in this war and split Germany's forces into two to really make it that much more difficult for them. This is called D-Day. Or sometimes in the military terms called Operation Overlord. But this, if it's successful, is going to breed a two-front assault on the Germans, and they're going to be kind of split to nothing. We're really pushing them from the south still, and hopefully we can crumble them very, very quickly. This is a map of what's happening post D-Day. So D-Day is going to happen successful. Maybe you heard of the Normandy invasion, right? You can see a little bit right here, right, this little circle right here of where that lands. And after that invasion, you notice that June 6th, 1944, Berlin falls May 2nd, 1945. Less than a calendar year from the successful invasion on Normandy Beach of D-Day, Hitler will have committed suicide, German Reich will have fallen, and World War II in Europe will have collapsed. So this is a monumental event. We take over these massive strategic points throughout France. We liberate Paris not long after. And even at the Battle of the Bulge down here, Hitler is going to try to launch this big counterattack 1944 to 1945 over the Christmas months. And that's even going to be unsuccessful. And so from this point out, we're going to be able to put our massive amount of tanks and men that we're shipping out of the United States. We get this massive hub in this base that we're able to just use our brute strength, blunt force through Europe, and liberate the rest of Europe in the fall of the Germans. Now, it leads us into our next conference. Our next conference is going to be at Yalta. Now, Yalta is a huge conference. There are not a lot of battles that we're really going to talk about in World War II. I will mention a couple of them, but the biggest one, D-Day, is super important to really understand that turning point of military events. But we meet at these conferences. These conferences are almost more important than these battles when we're talking about for APUS history, because Yalta really is when it's not a matter of if World War II is going to end and they're going to defeat them, but just a matter of when. And so Yalta is another one of these conferences of us figuring out what's going to happen at the end of the war. Stupid way I remember this one is Y is almost at the end of the alphabet. We're almost the end. You're almost to Z. So when you get there, you got to be ready to figure out what comes next. We're almost done with World War II. We got to figure out what we're going to do next. Stalin is very hesitant about giving up all of this land that he has, quote unquote, liberated throughout this conquest to defeat the Nazis. But he does agree to give them self-determination, give them that ability. They can either recognize their independence, they can give them that ability to choose if they want to stay a part of the Soviet Union. These are going to be completely rigged elections, and they're going to vote to stay back with the Soviet Union, but it kind of appeases the Allied forces who do believe him at this time. The biggest fear that Stalin has is just like in World War I and World War II, if there is a World War III coming up around the bend, they don't really know what the future is going to hold. They're fearful of yet and again another German leader going in, invading Russia or the Soviet Union, killing their people, and that's what he's really, really fighting against. So that's number one, really dealing with how we're going to handle these post-World War II colonies or pieces of land that we've taken over that were under Nazi control. Um, he's also going to agree to send troops to help us fight Japan after Germany is defeated. And that's the big key there. It's not going to be right away, but he says once we get the Germans surrender, that Stalin's going to agree if they could keep a chunk of China called Manchuria, which is what the Japanese originally invaded, right? It's mineral rich for sure, but we're looking for all the military support we can get, right? And Stalin is slowly kind of growing this empire, trying to create a buffer zone around all these other countries around him, fearful of another invasion. So we see this number one, this first thing is agreeing to self-determination in Europe. Number two, sending troops to the Pacific after Germany surrenders. The next big thing here is there is one last thing we can talk about with Yalta, and that's the creation of the United Nations. Now, you don't need to copy down every little bit and piece of information here, but understanding that there is an agreement made, hopefully you create an international peacekeeping organization. This repeals and replaces the League of Nations, which Woodrow Wilson and the United States never were actually able successfully to join. But we're going to create a brand new international peacekeeping organization called the UN, or the United Nations, which is still around today. But it's going to be different. There's going to be what they call five policemen, five of the most powerful countries: the United States, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union, to hopefully deal with any emergency action that these major countries, major players, are going to be able to kind of pull that trigger to move and shake in the right direction. So we see a lot of changes coming here for sure, but this is definitely not everything. Now, when we're talking about the United Nations, there are a lot of changes. You don't need to know the general framework necessarily of this, but do understand that there are a lot of things going on here with the United Nations. It's highly organized. All 50 member nations are going to be represented in like the General Assembly, which is similar to, if you think of it like a Congress, if you will, of all of these, and they're all going to be represented there. We're also going to have these 5 police powers, these extra special countries, USSR, France, China, Great Britain, and the United States of America are all going to make up this Security Council, this kind of executive level. And they're all going to have a veto power over the other members. So these countries, because we're in this massive position of power and we end up on the right side of World War II, we're going to be able to make these huge, huge decisions. And the other little thing down here that I really like to draw attention to is now this international peacekeeping organization, mind you, has an army. The UN forces do exist. So this creates a way of enforcing these, which is one of the biggest critiques of the League of Nations. Here's just a couple photos of those big 3 at Yalta. Yalta is going to be the last time that these 3 gentlemen meet: Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. The last war conference that these 3 men are really going to meet at, because something tragic happens. Not long after getting reelected for his 4th term in 1944, which means he takes office at the beginning of 1945 in January, according to the new amendment. In February of 1945, you have the Yalta Conference, and not long after, Roosevelt is going to pass away. As per American rules in our country, the way our government is set up, after the president is unfit to serve or passes away, what's going to happen not long after is that vice president will take over if he is fit to serve. And in this case, his vice president, who was picked to balance his ticket in 1944 to make him seem a little bit more of a moderate, Harry Truman, is now going to take office and become president of the United States. FDR will not see the end of what happens with Nazi Germany. FDR will not see the end of what happens with the Empire of Japan or have anything to do with the decision to actually drop the atomic bomb. But Harry Truman is going to have to pick up those reins. And where do we go after World War II? So this creates a lot of rippling effects for our country. Where do we go next? So as we get deeper into this World War II story, one thing that we haven't talked about yet was really the Holocaust. Now, the important thing to talk about when you're taking an AP US history course is this is not determine what is most valuable in history to learn about or human history, because there are things that we do have to skip over for the sake of time. But one big question that a lot of people have just in general, regardless if they're students or not, is what did the American government know about the Holocaust and what was their response? Now, the Holocaust is not an intense motivator for the United States in World War II, because for the most part, we don't really know about it. There are documents that indicate as early as the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, American top leaders had begun to hear evidence or hear claims about what was happening in these Nazi camps. But again, no one would believe that something like this would actually happen. It was so atrocious. Now, there is going to be discovery of these camps once the land is being taken over and liberated in about 1945. Drastically going to change, but it's not really a cause of what America has done in World War II. Afterwards, the Holocaust is really used as justification for what happens to these Nazis that are captured or what happens to the Japanese after World War II or during World War II in the United States with like those internment camps. And so it's a really good justification from the American point of view of why are we doing the things that we're doing. Right, we have to win at all costs, and these people deserve it. Of that, we're breaking down against the Germans or against the Japanese, especially with the dropping of the atomic bomb. But as we really push into Germany and Poland from the east, you're going to have the Soviet Union, as you see labeled right here. From the west, you're going to have the Allied forces. If you noticed, right, the extermination camps, death camps, as usually is what they're described, you're really going to see them here labeled. These are all going to be deeper on the eastern side of Europe in the midst of Poland. And so this is where the Soviet troops are really going to first land, so they're going to find them much earlier than we will. Meanwhile, coming from the West is going to be the Allied forces. And the Allied forces are really going to find them as we start to move later throughout this land as we go throughout this war. But the Soviets are going to find them much sooner. And this is where the concentration camps, similar to some of these internment camps, but even worse, like work camps, work to die, and then death camps, which are made for just pure extermination of people, mass murder, are going to begin. Now, the one that you may know and you may have heard is of Auschwitz or Birkenau. This is the largest of the death camps, the most productive killing machines in World War II. It's going to be at Auschwitz. There are different clips you can watch. My personal favorite is going to be one from a series of Band of Brothers, an HBO series, and you can check out this link down here in the actual PowerPoint, or you can find it on YouTube sometimes, or on HBO if you have HBO Go. And there, it really gives you a good grasp of the shock and the awe for a lot of these American troops that they stumble upon these camps. Now, there will be a lot of happy and celebrating, but there's still many people are dead, piles of bodies. The Nazis tried to kill as many people as they could as they heard the Allied forces were getting closer and closer, and destroyed a lot of documents, blew up some places, or until they ran out of bullets, then fled to the next camp and did the same thing, one after the other, trying to outlast the Allied forces from getting there. But all of this terrible stuff is going to be justification, really, for our treatment of Japanese citizens in like the internment camps, or our perceptions about other people of these concentration camps of the Holocaust is going to be justified by this. You can really see this in this AP core concept. So that's really where the Holocaust fits in. There's a lot of other things you can go into it. There's a lot more depth and sadness and stories of heroism in the Holocaust. But for our purpose, for this course, this is really where we're going to put those breaks. Now, just to give you a sense of scope about the Holocaust is the level is unparalleled. Now, Stalin, throughout his tenure in power, is going to kill more people, more of his own citizens, than Hitler ever will. But Hitler does this in a very short amount of time, and the difference is Hitler is going for an ethnic cleansing. He's trying to remove these people from the face of the earth for eternity. Now, when we talk about the Holocaust, the largest population that is typically talked about are the Jewish people. Whether we're talking about not only the religion, but almost that ethnicity or race of Jews. Now, almost 6 million, right, Jews were killed in the Holocaust, far larger than any other group, but there are others that are also affected as well. Anybody that Hitler deemed undesirable, but Jews are by and large the largest group that is affected by the Holocaust, because they are attempted to be eradicated from world history forever to come. And this map is really, I think, it's really powerful when you look at this map. So the darker the color shows you these different regions where the percentage of pre-war Jews that existed there, what percentage of them were killed. So in that really dark maroon area, right, 80 to 90% of the pre-World War II Jews that lived in those areas were killed. It's staggering, alarming numbers, but you can really see where a lot of these concentration camps were, where they were pulled from, but they did pull from other areas as well. Just absolutely awful. But this sort of action, this sort of discussion will be kind of revealed as these horrible things, and will begin to information escapes different corners of the world about what's happening. In 1945, in April, the Soviet army captures Berlin, takes hold of Berlin. In that same month, Hitler, instead of being captured, he's actually going to commit suicide, have his body burned, so no one can, in his mind, desecrate it in the same way of what happened to Mussolini. And then on May 9th, 1945, the German government signs an unconditional surrender. So if we're looking back to early June 1944, when D-Day happens, less than a calendar year, World War II is over. It's a huge turning point. It's a direct correlation. Think about how long World War II had been going on, September 1st, 1939, right? So we're over on like 5 years, right? 5.5. And then from when the United States joined, the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, we really hadn't had that much success for the first 2 years. Then 1944 rolls around, D-Day rolls around, and then after that successful landing in Normandy Beach, we lead to the collapse of the German army not long later. All right, so that is the end of World War II in Europe, and now we see ourselves taking on World War II in Asia, which is going to be very different, very different. So one thing that you should be able to note when you really look at this map is there is a geographical difference between Europe and Southeastern Asia, between the German and Italian Empire and the Japanese Empire. Very different. So we can have our Dora the Explorer moment in here. What's different between this and Europe? Very good. You'll notice that all of these are islands. So our plan to handle World War II in Europe was this massive invasion, this turning point that led to this collapse. That's all good and well, but you don't have a mainland to really invade until we get up to mainland Japan. But how are you going to get all those troops there? It's not that short gap like across the English Channel. There's a lot of land to be taken over. One thing that's really going to change this discussion is our new campaign. It's called the Island Hopping Campaign. It's a strategy about how the United States tries to take over, win, and turn the tides of this war. We're going to take over specific islands strategically. We're trying not to spend a lot of time, resources, or American lives because our ships are far from top notch, really, really struggling. We're really going to see these different areas, these different pockets throughout. You can follow this blue line here toward the lower part of the map of where we're going to lead this conquest. Yes, liberating different parts of like French Indochina, the Philippines, eventually would be Thailand, Vietnam. But as we're moving throughout, taking over these strategic islands one after the other until we get close enough to mainland Japan. So we have some major events that really do try to change the morale and the scope of the war. We have the Doolittle raid in April of 1942. Huge morale boost. These men go in and they bomb mainland Japan for the very first time in history. And this really shakes the Japanese. The planes go down. They don't have enough fuel to get around. They go down in Japanese controlled China. And many Chinese civilians give their lives to help protect these American soldiers, to help them liberate and get to freedom, get extracted, and then they can continue these bombings throughout the war. We have major events like the Battle of Midway. There's a brand new movie that just came out within the past year on it. It's pretty good. Talks about the battle and the impact of where this is. It gives us real naval supremacy in the sense that we get a major key victory. We're moving in. We're taking out some of their huge ships. We're able to kind of counterattack them for sure, one, but two, we're able to crack some of their communication codes and predict kind of where they're able to move next. The last thing, and this kind of reaches back to our point on the Holocaust, is the Japanese are not necessarily playing by the rules, so to speak. Public beheading, torturing of people, aiming at civilians. Their treatment of the Chinese people, especially, is going to be some of our justification for treatment, not only during the war on the battlefield, but also at home. You can also look at a couple different accounts of some terrible things that have happened. These different accounts include an event called the Raping at Nanjing. It happened in the 1930s. These terrible, terrible atrocities by the Japanese army invading into the old capital of China, Nanjing. And these links can take you to, you can look up a documentary, and Woody Harrelson is in it. And they reenact and read old letters, really seeing what is happening in this city from multiple perspectives. So, with all of this information in mind, we're looking at the atrocities of the Japanese Empire. We're looking at the kind of the geographical challenges that are facing us. We can compare and contrast that to what's going on in Europe, and that's going to be very different experiences for soldiers. The other big thing we really have to remember is kind of where we are starting in this, and it's going to lead to a lot of our decisions. Never forget Pearl Harbor. Do not forget what happened here. It's the major reason why we come into World War II. So that's going to be very important for us. But as we continue this discussion, we're going to see a couple key battles, and The two biggest battles really in Asia that are going to bring about the end of World War II in Asia are the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These allow us the possibility of massive land invasion, which is our #1 strategy, very similar to D-Day. In Asia, major bombing runs, anything we need logistically, noting that they are the two closest islands. You can note them right here, boom, and here, boom, right near the mainland islands. You get this iconic photo at Iwo Jima of the American soldiers raising that flag on the battlefield, and that sign of kind of American grit and patriotism and fighting for justice. But ultimately, when Germany actually surrenders in 1945, the United States can turn its entire front of its army and economy towards taking out Japan, and so the story begins to escalate. So we don't really have this definitive end ultimately with how to defeat Japan. It's not just this mainland land invasion that we just continue moving and moving and moving and moving. We have to keep scaling these invasions. The reason why it becomes very uncertain is because of our plan. We didn't immediately think the war was going to end right after the surrender of Germany. We favored a real full-scale invasion, again, D-Day style of Tokyo, where most people live in or around on the mainland of Japan by 1946. And that's our initial plan, but that's still a whole year away, another year of war. Ultimately, the other reason that makes this very tricky is the Japanese are refusing to surrender. Their emperor is telling them not to surrender. Culturally, there is a huge disconnect between the United States and the Japanese, where the emperor is viewed as a god. So if we are requesting them to surrender, or we want them to step down, telling the emperor, a god, to step down is a huge cultural devastation blow. So that's really not going to happen right away. That's almost a non-starter for them, and that creates a lot of resentment, conflict. In addition to that, it's, are we going to let this leader stay in power? For us, that doesn't seem acceptable either. And to make things even more complex, he starts telling civilians to arm themselves. We have guns, we have grenades. So if we do invade, we're not just taking out the soldiers, we're taking out all of these civilians, could be anywhere in the city, that are willing to literally fight to the death. So we take ourselves to our last World War II era conference, the Potsdam Conference. This happens in the middle of 1945, July of 1945, and Truman unleashes this information upon the other major leaders of Great Britain and the Soviet Union, right, meeting again and again for the first time of this new era. It's not FDR anymore. We have this brand new weapon called the atomic bomb, the likes the world has never seen before. The atomic bomb at this time is 2,000 times more powerful than the most explosive weapon known to man in 1945. So this is absolutely unparalleled, devastating power. The atomic bomb was created in part of a top secret project called the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project was not actually done in Manhattan, New York City, if you'll note. It would be kind of stupid to create this massively explosive, volatile weapon in the middle of our country's most populated city. So we spread it out. In the University of Chicago, the very first nuclear reactor is developed, which is going to allow this atomic weapon to work. And up in Washington State and down in Tennessee, harness this energy, mass produce it in various facets, and then assemble it and test it down in New Mexico. Dr. Robert J. Oppenheimer is the doctor, the father of the atomic bomb, detonates the first successful atomic bomb in world history. And this is going to drastically change the scale of warfare for the end of World War II, yes, but for the future as well. Now, this discussion is not kind of completed without talking about Albert Einstein, who a lot of people associate with being the father of the atomic bomb, which isn't true. He is actually a refugee from Europe trying to escape the clutches of the Nazi rule. And he warns FDR actually in about 1939 that the Germans are possibly creating this weapon of mass destruction, that they need to start prepping for it too. So this does start as early as the Roosevelt administration, but actually comes to fruition in the Truman administration. And by the time we actually did develop it, we warned or we threatened the Japanese that we're going to use these weapons. We have a couple different questions about what we should do. Should we run to a test site and show them there? Should we warn them specifically what we're going to do and where we're going to bomb it? But are they going to move our prisoners of war there? So we're going to have to sacrifice civilians. Do we drop it without warning? But what do we do about civilians there? There's a lot of different questions. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we are the very first country to use an atomic bomb on other people. We use it in war. We don't only use one, we use two. We use both of the ones that we have created, the only two in existence at that moment in time. So we use those bombs. Now, there are a vast amount of effects. They are positive, right? Now, by positive, I put that in quotes from the American perspective. It's a very complex issue. It's not just dropping this bomb. You could argue it saves thousands of American lives for sure. If we do that land invasion, imagine the amount of soldiers that are going to die, and then also maybe even Japanese lives if we invaded Tokyo. But one of the biggest factors here is this revenge for Pearl Harbor. You cannot forget Pearl Harbor. It's the only time really that American soil was attacked on the home front, and it's not taken lightly. It is this I guess if you take it for your great grandparents, right, people from that era, it's the equivalent of what 9/11 is for those of us that are around today. And then also the other big thing that it does is this is part of maybe some of the intended effect, right? But large lasting effect. It shows the Soviet Union that America has this ultimate weapon, that we are, right, this ultimate powerhouse. But after using 2 atomic bombs on the mainland island of Japan, they will surrender. There are real photos of these explosions happening, especially that one on the right. You can see that reflection on the water, just to give you that idea of scale of how massive this explosion is, how devastating it is. Lets out large amounts of radiation, and it's going to have lasting effects not only then, but now. These 2 cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on the southern tip of the island. We purposely didn't drop it on Tokyo, but again, trying to cripple not only the war effort, but show them the devastation of what we could do as we get closer. These towns get completely leveled and decimated. If you look at this picture of Hiroshima, you see that very little is left standing. Sparse amounts of buildings. There's the inferno of the heat that's released at the epicenter of the explosion, plus the force and the blast waves that rip and the radiation that still lingers. The half-life of that radiation makes it last for a very long time. You see these terrible wounds of people where the burns from the radioactive blast etch these designs into their skin and does devastating damage to them. Temples are destroyed, not just civilian buildings. You can't really pick and choose what's destroyed. But at the end of the day, Japan is going to surrender unconditionally. The emperor will step down, and peace at last is had in the United States. This is a great little timeline for you to check out. Really shows the scope of how the Axis powers grow to power, and you can see that timeline at the bottom. The black is the Axis powers, right? We see the Italians, we see the Germans, we see the Japanese, and how large it goes until America is actually getting ready to join the war. America's still not in the war yet. Now America's joined the war. We're not really joining this winning side, and they're still expanding in different areas. So this doesn't look like an easy path to victory. There is fighting back in Africa, and there is control being taken back in the Soviet Union, but not until D-Day do we really break into mainland Europe, which is going to happen right now. Then from there, that the collapse of the European empire is going to happen very quickly, but the U.S. Still has to take care of that enemy in Japan, and then eventually the unconditional surrender, the dropping of the atomic bomb. The other thing for us to really look at as we really pack up this battlefield discussion is the loss of lives. And think about the countries that are deeply affected here. Look at the loss of lives. These Eastern European countries like Latvia and Lithuania, but also Poland. And a lot of that death, when you look at the civilian death total, a lot of that can be associated to the Holocaust for sure, along with the Chinese and the atrocities by the Japanese and the Soviet Union, who faces a large amount of life. So they're going to want harsh kind of reconstruction going forward post World War II. Yay, World War II is finally over. VE Day, Victory over Europe Day, or VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. Right? Americans all over the country are celebrating. You have those iconic photos of people kissing each other and where. But really, just some final takeaways for us before I really sign off here. But World War II, when you're talking about big picture stuff, it's the largest, deadliest war in history. Completely changes the way the U.S. thinks of itself in relation to the world, it acts in relation to the world, and the rest of the world reacts to the United States. Our industry ends the Great Depression, so economic effects. The size of our government is drastically changing, so political effects. And we kind of go into a very affluent decade, very similar to the end of World War I going into the Roaring 20s. But we have all these fail safes set up in the 1930s, so we're going to see how well these things actually work. We get to keep this prosperity going. Lastly, large global picture here, right? America comes out as the superpower almost. There were really only the major superpower left. There's a lot of countries that are left rebuilding, and there are a lot of major players throughout the world, but America really skyrockets to the top of this list. We also begin to develop this nuclear arsenal now that we have this capability. It becomes super important in the following decades. And as the atomic bomb is dropped on Japan, some historians say that when one bomb was dropped to end one war, another war immediately began. And that's the Cold War, which we'll start picking up in later videos. Other than that, I just have a couple other links here for you if you really want to kind of expand your knowledge for personal interest. Really, really great interview between Oprah Winfrey and Elie Wiesel, who is the author of a Holocaust memoir, first person of his account, Surviving Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, he's interviewed in Auschwitz, which is really extraordinary, very moving, very powerful. The best depiction of D-Day in film is Saving Private Ryan. And so the beginning of the movie, it's about 20, 30 minutes long, really, really bloody and gory, but a really great introduction to the topic. And that Band of Brothers clip I was talking about earlier in the video with the Holocaust. I love that series. Really, really good, I think, depictions of it. That's just a clip to that, Discovering the Holocaust, the 9th episode of that series. So other than that, if you have any questions, drop a comment down below, reach out, and I'll get back to you. Take care, folks.